How about now? A little better? Okay. Well, this is fun. We had to set up extra chairs in here. Love to see all your faces. Please join me in welcoming the fairly new Dr. Rachel Lamb. That's exciting too. As our Carhart speaker. This is part of the DWU speaker series that Joel has done a great job of putting together on campus. Today's message, I think, is a fun one for us, especially for a Christian university. The 11 a.m. talk is definitely going to be much more personal on Rachel's journey of how she's gotten where she is. Tonight at 7 o'clock, I encourage you to join us again. That will be much more technical, talking about the work that she does in the space of climate change. We also have at 3 p.m. a meet and greet, so if there were some burning questions you had after today's talk, please join us over at Tiger Cafe at 3 p.m. for some coffee and conversation. We will also, if you are coming to the 7 p.m., having some hors d'oeuvres before, if you want to come a little bit early and share that with us. As a little bit of background, and I'm sure you all were able to read on here, but Rachel is coming to us from Maryland. So that was a nice little plane ride, get to see some of the country on her way over. Home for her, though, is actually Grand Rapids, Michigan. So she is a Midwest girl at heart. She enjoys, I would say, exploring. She has a goal of visiting all 400 national parks. She's over halfway there. Some of you, I know, will share that with her. She is also an avid pet lover. So something else that you can share in common with her. I will let Rachel take over and let you know kind of how she wants the talk to go as far as answering and asking questions, but definitely feel free to ask questions as the morning goes along.
All right, I'm going to try using this mic. Hopefully you can hear me and they can adjust as needed. How's the sound in the back? Good? Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to come share a little bit more with you about the work that I do, broadly speaking, on environmental stewardship and actually thinking a lot more about this hot topic issue of climate change. So again, during our time here today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and my journey for why I came to CARE, some of the organizations that I work with that kind of help make those connections. And I would really invite some dialogue and discussion with all of you. Help me understand where you're coming to the table, from which vantage points, which lenses, and then I think it'll be an interesting time of discussion and conversation at the end. So I'm going to go first, and then and hiking and camping and just exploring the world. And of course I had a sense that all the beauty that we see and enjoy being outdoors comes from maybe the one who created it. God is a good God and he loves the world and he made it beautiful and we can enjoy it. But I didn't entirely quite understand how I could pull together my faith in terms of loving God and loving my neighbor with some kind of vocational track or professional track in environment. So what did it mean to study the environment? Why would you spend your time studying it and caring for it? How did those things fit together? So maybe like some of you, I was really interested at this exploration. So I decided to go to a private liberal arts college, Christian college called Wheaton College. It's in Chicago. And their motto is for Christ and his kingdom, which is interesting because what I wanted to ask is, could I actually study the environment and take its stewardship seriously as a Christian? Could I do it for Christ and for his kingdom? What did that mean? And I really had a really interesting time in college. Maybe like some of you, I was exposed to maybe some different ideas, some different worldviews. I inherited some general skepticism to some issues like climate change because everyone around me in my local church congregation and in most of the community that I grew up in was kind of not quite sure how they felt about it either, right? It seemed kind of first and foremost like a political issue, not really quite sure how it makes sense or is relevant to our day-to-day lives. And so I used this opportunity in college to ask some questions. I'd show up and go to classes and kind of probe and ask, what does the science actually say? Because if you had asked me what I thought about it, I probably wouldn't have had a really great answer at the time. But what I wanted to do is better understand it. So I learned a little bit more about the science behind it, and I wanted to spend more time out in community with people, understanding if they were really seeing the impacts and why it mattered. That brings me to one of the most, I think, formative experiences that I had during my time in college. So one summer, I worked with the EPA's Tribal Trust and Assistance Unit. So I know that here in South Dakota and in this region, you have a lot of tribal nations. It's a part of the landscape and that has a lot of rich, meaningful culture and history here. There are over 200 tribes in the Pacific Northwest and including in Alaska. And so when I was working with the Tribal Trust and Assistance Unit, we were really asking questions about what changes those tribal communities were experiencing across the landscape and what was the impact of those changes. So just like many communities like you have around here who work the land, who are close to it, who understand it, you are able to notice how some of those changes, like to weather or extreme events, impacts your livelihoods and impacts, your ability to work the land. Well, tribes are often, especially those in Alaska, are subsistence-based, meaning all of the food that they're getting, of course, is basically around them in terms of hunting and gathering. And so I flew in a little bush plane to the village of Tyonek, which is on Cook Inlet. And if you were looking at Alaska as a whole, it's near Anchorage as the reference point. And when I was there, I was listening to some of the experiences that they were having around extreme events impacting coastline erosion, about changes and impacts to the temperature of their streams and how that was impacting salmon. Salmon are cold water fish. They like it really cold, and if you have subtle changes to stream temperature, that can affect their spawning, and that was a primary source of protein. They're talking a lot about these changes that they were experiencing, and what was interesting is these people are incredibly resilient and incredibly adaptive, right? We talked about it earlier in the class, thinking about Alaska, you're used to a lot of extreme events, right? You're used to a lot of variability. So the fact that you as a local community are actually noticing trends or changes, even amidst that variability, that are affecting your way of life is serious. It's serious for their ability to access enough regular and nutritious food. It was affecting their infrastructure, and the fact that in many coastal cities in Alaska, you see basically homes being eroded right into the ocean, and it was affecting their way of life and ability to culturally adapt. And what was key here was the pace and degree of change. I would have had no idea growing up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, not living and working the land as closely as I did, as some of my neighbors did. I just wouldn't have had a sense that maybe climate change was happening at the scale that it was, and that it really could impact people's way of life. So bringing back this experience and thinking about these real people and their real stories, and kind of asking more questions in the classroom, what I really realized is three things. So climate change really is happening now. We think about it as a future kind of problem, and it will continue to be a future kind of problem, but it's actually happening around us today. It is because of us that there is some kind of action or that's happening that it goes beyond what we can explain by natural causes, and it's serious. And the serious question, I think, plays out and hits that sort of moving from what does the science tell us is happening? The science gives us data and information and helps us understand the fingerprint on the world. But identifying it as a problem, that's a value-laden statement. That's an ethical point of view. Something is a problem if it conflicts with something that you think is right or wrong. And I want to explore that one in a little bit more detail in a moment. So first of all, climate change is happening now. I gave you this example from the tribal community in Tyonek, but I think it's helpful to think about it as concentric circles. So in the middle of this circle, it might be hard to read, but we have our drivers, right? Those are the things that cause change. And there's a lot of inherent natural variability. And then overlaid on top of that are things that people are doing that, again, exacerbate or make worse some of these variability that we're experiencing. So greenhouse gases and also land use change are the drivers. So who cares? There's added greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's like putting an extra blanket around the earth. So hey, our atmosphere keeps us nice and warm. If it didn't keep us warm, we wouldn't be able to live here as humans. So the atmosphere is really great for making it hospitable. But when you add greenhouse gases, it's like adding layers and layers of blankets. It's like if you were in a sleeping bag and then suddenly you kept adding more and more blankets on top, things are going to get uncomfortably hot and toasty. And so what you start to see is the earth adapting or responding to this change in heat. And it's not just increasing global temperatures, it's also thinking about warming oceans and thinking about changes to how the ocean is moving and its currents. It's thinking about more extreme weather. And all of these impacts to our climate impact how we interact with our world every day. So you see in the largest circle impacts like a risk to water supplies. Like if you have more extreme drought, that's going to impact the type of water supply that you have. It could also, with more extreme heat days, impact heat stress. And the fact that if it's very hot and you have nowhere, let's say, to go to get out of the heat, that has a direct impact on mortality. There's all of these different ways that we can assess the fingerprint of this changing climate to the land, to our society, and the people that are impacted. Now, just for a moment on these drivers, I think it's important, again, to acknowledge that even though we see a wide range of factors that would influence our climate, right? Of course, we have natural causes like solar and volcanic drivers and all of these different ways that our world is beautifully designed to work in cycles. That is still happening, but superimposed against the natural variability is the things that we are doing. So sometimes that might mean the production of aerosols like sulfur dioxide and ammonia and black carbon. All of those things have an impact. And in many cases, that actually can have a cooling impact on the environment. So if you see the blue line there, it is actually showing that aerosols actually have a net cooling impact. But what you also see is that we, in the production, particularly of the way that we produce energy, when we're releasing a lot of greenhouse gases, that is what is, again, adding that extra layer of blanket and keeping things warmer. And if we look at observation, so that's like temperature data that we're collecting from the air, we're collecting in the water, we can see that our observations actually follow what would happen if we're combining both those human and natural causes together. So it's happening today. It's because of us, and largely because of our human activity. And it's serious. So this was a study I think is interesting that the Brookings Institute put out. And they were looking at the cost. What are the climate-related costs associated with all of these different impacts that we're seeing? So one thing I want you to notice, I'm a geographer, so I love maps. One thing I want you to notice is that everyone is affected. Okay? The impacts are widespread. But what you should also notice from this map is that they're highly inequitable. So some places are impacted more than others. In these studies, they looked at climate change impacts to agriculture, to human mortality, to coastal damage, and labor supply. And by and large, they saw that when the highest risk or largest determinant of overall cost was actually human health and human mortality. And they also saw that when people die or you have a significant mortality, it negatively impacts the economy. They also saw that additional costs with variation related to agriculture and agricultural production. And of course, because climate changes vary a lot over space, in some places it might cause increased drought. In other places it might cause increased precipitation and increased flooding. And our ability as a society to adapt and to become more resilient to those things really depends on our access to resources. So in some parts of the southern part of the US where there already are pre-existing challenges related to poverty and access to resources, climate change just makes that worse. So not only is it serious, but it's highly inequitable. That means that there are certain types of communities and individuals that are on the front lines of climate impacts. And another way of thinking about this is who contributes and who experiences it. So as I already mentioned, we all have contributed, and we inherited a world in which other people made decisions we didn't have direct control over, right? We're inheriting a changing world. And in fact, there's not a single person under 30 here, or even under 35, who has experienced a world that wasn't warming. So the average annual global temperature of the Earth has only been warming every year you've been alive. That means you've inherited a warming world, and that's what we experience. In the countries like the US and in other countries in the so-called developing world, we've contributed the most to the problem. But we also tend to be the ones who are not as vulnerable because in general, we have access to resources to be able to adapt. So there's a highly inequitable impact globally. Those who contributed the least, historically and today, often are on the front lines of climate change impacts. So given this context, this background, yes, climate change is happening now. It's because of us and it's serious, but there's so much that we can, and perhaps I might suggest should, do. All right, so coming out of college, this was a bit overwhelming. If I was trying to pull all these pieces together and thinking about this as a massive global problem, it's hard to wrap your mind around exactly so what. How can we come together to actually think about a different future? What do we want the world to look like that we inherit? And how do we make sure that those who are most impacted have the resources they need to adapt? And one of the responses to this, particularly thinking about it from a faith-informed lens, was to start an organization called Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. So there was a group of us from colleges and universities across the country, recent grads, and we were sort of looking around our kind of evangelical faith community, and we were seeing these strong connections between, loving God, loving our neighbor, loving the world God created, and seeing those things as deeply connected, especially under the threat of a changing climate, but weren't seeing much leadership in the church. We were looking around and saying, who's talking about this? Who's leading the way on this? And so we decided to just form an organization which could really provide a sense of community, an opportunity for younger people to gather together and to really assert that we cared about this explicitly because we are Christians, not in spite of being Christians. And our strategy was threefold. So one, again, we really wanted to provide support for a new generation of Christians to act and advocate together. Instead of feeling isolated in communities where you're maybe the only one thinking about this and trying to take it seriously, you're connected with other people who care too. I'm sure you've experienced that with a lot of different types of things you might care about. Sometimes it can be hard to be sticking your neck out and feeling like this makes so much sense that these things are related, but why am I not seeing more people doing something about it or talking about it? So we wanted to provide a community of support that was based on our shared identity. And we also wanted to equip people to impact their faith communities. So how do we go back and think about the people at Highland Hills Baptist Church that loved and nurtured me and in my life? How can I think about how I can connect those values that I have with them around why we should care about these topics like environmental stewardship and climate change? How do we talk about it, and how do we kind of pull these threads together? And then the third one is really thinking about how it's impacted at a policy lens. And what I really want to emphasize here is how we think about this triangle. So often, and I'm sure for many of you, I mentioned this in the class earlier, but when we hear climate change, we think politics. I bet when most of you think about it, you think, oh, it's a political issue. And then that might mean that you stop there and you don't want to go further, or for some people, maybe you're interested, but it's really hard to get through the political siloing that's occurring. But what we really wanted to assert is that, no, first of all, let's understand what the science is telling us via people that we trust. How do we understand the fingerprint of human impact in the world? Second of all, ask why should this matter to us? Why should we care if people and the creation itself are being negatively impacted? Why does this matter to us and our faith? And if we do say it matters, that's a value-laden judgment, then we want all good solutions on the table. That might mean individual lifestyle choices. It might mean how I work in my local communities and my local places, but it also might mean asking all of our political leaders, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or have no political affiliation, to propose good solutions. We want all good solutions at the table. If we truncate the conversation from the beginning as political, we lose really the opportunity to really make headway here. So what I want to emphasize to you is that middle part, the why should we care? I think something that makes YCA's work as an example distinctive is that Christians act in response to who God is and what he's already done. And that's really important. We act in response. So if we're acting in response to something, then that really means that we have to understand who God is and what he loves, right? So if I'm studying who God is, and the fact that he loves and cares for the world that he created, and he loves it enough that he died for it, and he loves it enough that he was raised to life, and he's pointing towards resurrection and restoration. If I believe that, and I believe that that's true for not just individuals, but for society and for all of creation, then I have to take seriously anything that seems to threaten that ability to love what God loves well. So I want to assert here that the reason why we care about acting on climate change out of faith and love and hope is simply in response to God's love and mercy for us. So that might mean that when we ask different kinds of questions. So given what we know, and I gave you like a high-level summary, but given what we know about the causes and impacts of climate change, then we have to continually ask ourselves, well, what is loving and unloving about maybe our current actions? Maybe we didn't have all the information we needed to know before, but now that we do know, what does that mean moving forward? We might also ask, what does faithfulness and obedience look like to God in this context? That requires me, again, to know something about what he cares about and what it means to follow him in every area of life, including how I think about the environment. And then you might also ask what hopeful living looks like. What's hopeful living with a view of a future, not just our present situation? And that's not to undermine that a lot of times we're dealing with really acute stressors in our present lives, right? And sometimes it feels like maybe some of these bigger issues seem kind of abstract. But I think living in hope means that we are looking forward to a beautiful kingdom of God that he describes to us, which is about restoration of relationship and restoration, again, of relationship with all of creation and with each other. So if that's the goal or that's the view, then how do I live today in light of that? So these are biblical and theological frameworks that I learned when I was in my church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but I wasn't able to think about necessarily how they applied to these topics until I had the chance to think through them. So one of the statements that I really resonated with was written by a collective of over 4,000 global Christian leaders as part of the Lausanne network. So this is a broadly speaking evangelical network of churches and denominations from all over the world. And in 2010, they wanted to kind of chart out a commitment, like what does Christian witness look like in the world today? What should be marked by our witness such that somebody says, oh, those are Christians? Of course they're Christians out there doing X, Y, Z, because we would expect that of them if they are really trying to follow Christ and being faithful in this world. So what does this look like? And they have a beautiful statement, but they asserted three things that I think are helpful in this context. So first, the Bible declares God's redemptive purposes for creation itself. It means God is about people, he's about individuals, he's about society, but he also is about his whole world, his whole creation. And there's many times in Scripture that he talks about loving and redeeming and restoring it. So it matters. He gave it value, he called it good, he said it matters. The second thing is that means that integral mission, meaning what is the mission of God's people, or God in this world, is discerning and proclaiming and living out the truth that the gospel is God's good news. If you asked a Christian sort of what is the good news? Well, the good news is that Jesus died for us and he resurrected from the grave. He's alive. That is a symbol of restoration, of hope, of life. And he did it not just, again, for people in society, but also for all of creation. So that means that We know all three are broken and suffering. The fact that we even are dealing with climate change and its impacts on people is evidence that the world is suffering. But we also know that all three of them are included in his love and his mission. Nothing's outside of it. The whole world belongs to him, and he loves it all. And that means that for all of us who say that we want to serve God and want to care about what he cares about, it means all three of those things should be a part of our mission. So I have to know what's impacting the things that God loves, including his people, society, and creation itself. So how does this work itself out? Well, I think it requires us to demonstrate love for our global, local, and future neighbors. So we know that climate change impacts people's health, their security, their livelihoods, their well-being. It affects everyone, but it affects the poor and vulnerable first and worst. So that means in the New Testament scripture where Jesus calls us to really care for the poor and the vulnerable, well, climate change is making that harder to do. So taking climate change seriously and trying to think about how to slow the pace of change and to support people in adapting to that change is a way of caring for the poor and the vulnerable. We also know that it's going to impact our generation and future generations worse. That means that they are going to bear the brunt of the decisions made today. Just like we bear the brunt of decisions made from generations before us, right? We've inherited that. We continue to contribute it, but it also means we have an opportunity to think about the future that we want to leave someone else. And I think that is inherent to one of the greatest commandments that the Lord gives us, not only to love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your mind, but also to love your neighbor as yourself. So even though it affects all of us and it matters to you and me and maybe our children and our grandchildren, it also affects our neighbor. So taking climate change seriously is a way to love our neighbor. Taking climate change seriously is also a way to love and care for all of God's creation. So some of my background is in conservation and conservation biology, and as an environmental scientist, you learn to love and appreciate the world, the way those systems work, not just in natural settings like in parks, but also if you are working the land, you learn more about soil and soil health, and it is a beautiful living thing. You learn to love it and appreciate it, and as you start to see how it's meant to function, you also start to notice those changes and stressors across the landscape. So climate change makes some of those existing stressors, like pest outbreaks, for example, worse. So often the response of different kinds of species, like in the Badlands, which I love, like the black-footed ferret or the bison, they basically have to either adapt in place, so they're dealing with maybe more extreme heat conditions and drought. They have to figure out how they're going to adapt in place. They either have to move to keep up with change in terms of migration across the landscape, if they can do that outside of park boundaries, or they face local extinction. So thinking about management and how we best care for those species who didn't contribute to climate change at all, yet bear the impact and brunt of it, there's a lot of good work being done to think about how to care for it. There's also another example, I think, from one of my colleagues out in Ghana, in Arusha, Ghana. There's this beautiful Atewa National Park, and it's kind of what you would imagine as a kind of a beautiful tropical rainforest, and it's being threatened with deforestation and loss, and that actually can have a large climate impact. If you come to my talk later tonight, you'll understand sort of how we know that and why, but natural systems are really naturally good at storing carbon, which is, a derivative of one of the greenhouse gases I talked about. So it can actually be a solution to helping us mitigate climate change by storing carbon, but it also faces a lot of threat and deforestation and loss. So caring for that forest and caring for the species that are in it is a way to, again, not just celebrate the diversity of life that God made and gave value to, but also is another way of loving people, because it provides so many goods and services for us that we enjoy, like the fact that it regulates temperature, the fact that it's storing carbon, the fact that it actually purifies water so we have natural clean water to drink. We get all of those services for free, but when we don't steward the land well, then we also lose those benefits for people. Another third marker, I think, of a distinctive approach is we really should act on climate change or care about it because of our hope for restoration. So, in one pragmatic way of looking at it, when we take actions to mitigate present hazards. So there's some examples in this image of loss of life and stress due to intense wildfires, right? The West has just always has experienced fire on the landscape, but those fires are more intense and more extreme. So one actually solution to this is actually thinking about how investing in forest management can help reduce the risk of these superfires. Another might be asset loss and yield reductions in contamination due to flooding, serious hazard affecting present-day livelihoods. So investing, for example, in restoring wetlands, which help absorb and filter these floodwaters, is a good way of ensuring not only are you reducing present risk, but you're pointing to a future that is healthier and more resilient and restored. And I actually think this ties really strongly to the biblical idea of hope. Sometimes in contemporary culture, we use the word hope, and it just seems like, well, I wish this would happen, right? Or I'm optimistic it'll happen, but I'm not sure. But actually, biblical hope isn't really naive optimism, but it's rooted in God's promises to us. He said he loves us, he's shown us that he loves us, and he's shown us that he's committed to redeeming and restoring the world that he loves. And so we can claim that promise, and I think that restoration and caretaking of the world that he gave, so that's caretaking of the atmosphere, just like the land and our oceans, is actually a way of pointing towards that ultimate restoration that God has for his earth. So it's a deeply rooted hope for restoration. And finally, taking action on climate change is a way to demonstrate faithfulness in pursuit of mutual flourishing. So what do I mean by that? Well, if humans and human activity, whether we fully realized it or not, now we do, human action, if it's the primary driver of change, then it can also be for solutions. That means instead of feeling like there's a loss or despair about the change that's occurring, it means that we can actually do something about it. We have inherited and contributed to that change in climate, but we make new choices every day that can basically demonstrate that we do care about the people that are impacted the most, that we do care about creation that is suffering, but is and will be restored, and we can do it out of love, first and foremost, for God, and second, for our neighbor. That actually, by engaging in it, is an act of faithfulness and obedience. That doesn't always mean that in every case there's simple solutions. And in fact, I highlight in the figure up in the left-hand corner this really intricate web where basically our entire energy system, food system, and water system is all intricately connected, right? Choices in one impact the other. So the demand for certain energy supplies impacts how we grow our food and where and under what methods. That, of course, dynamically interacts with water systems in terms of what water we need and what we put into the water. So we've inherited this beautiful, complicated world. And what I think that God asks us to do is to identify our sphere of influence in this system, learn about it, study it, figure out where the points of leverage are, and then take actions that demonstrate mutual flourishing for both people, their well-being, their livelihoods, their health, and also mutual flourishing for creation itself. Because we know that a restored, healthy ecosystems, like I suggested on the previous slide, is actually intricately connected with healthy, restored human communities as well. So this act of faithfulness, I think, is something that's really inspiring to me in the work of Faden Simbataki. So Faden was one of our YCA Climate Leadership Fellows, and I'm going to plug that program for you in another minute. But most of our fellows are at American universities, but Faden was at a university in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, and he was really working with some colleagues in Kenya to think about the fact that they were on the front lines of a lot of climate change impacts for agriculture. And they also are subsistence communities, right? So they basically eat all the food that they grow directly. And they were experiencing a lot of changing, harsh conditions, particularly around drought, and actually more than anything, variability, high variability in weather patterns. And it was changing sort of what they were expecting to happen. And he was really working on the front lines to think about, well, how can we support certain types of agricultural practices in their context that made sense with the land, that could actually directly improve soil health and stability, but also make sure that it was supporting the well-being of the people that relied upon the land, and then actually in doing so also thinking about building resilience to ongoing climate change impacts. And yeah, they are also sequestering some carbon, another pitch for tonight's talk. So they actually is also a tool for slowing climate change, is improved management and soil practices. But he's really doing it because he loves the Lord and he loves his neighbor, and he wants to show how taking this seriously with whatever sphere of influence he has, which his sphere of influence in terms of economic and land and policy is maybe arguably not as wide as some of us sitting here in our American cultural context. But he, within his own sphere of influence, is thinking about what he can do. And that's an example that's really inspiring to me. Not because we have to find perfect silver bullet solutions, but he's asking the questions to say, how do we make this make sense to caring for the world and also caring for the people that rely upon it? So I just want to flag some organizations that I think are really on the front lines of trying to do this well, and they're trying to do it with their faith out front and center. So one of them that I already mentioned was Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. It's still around 10 years later. They're still supporting more than 30 climate leadership fellows every year. And what's really cool about that program is that it really supports investment in young emerging leaders on campuses who are asking really interesting questions broadly around environmental stewardship and conservation and climate, and providing you a cohort of support with other students like you from other campuses and universities who are trying to make sense of it, figure out how to communicate it, and how to take actions in your own local campus and communities that make sense based on where you're at. So that fellowship comes with a stipend. You get $1,000 a year to participate and access to funding to support events and all sorts of things on campus. And it's been really an inspiring program. I'm no longer part of the steering committee or on staff. I support as a senior advisor, but it's really fun to see the stories coming from students who are on the front lines of thinking about and actualizing, change in their local spaces. So YCA, their application period opens in it closes in early April. So if that is remotely interesting to you, you should come talk to me about it so I can connect you and put in a good word. But that organization is also connected to a broader one called the Evangelical Environmental Network, who also does a lot around different environmental policy issues. And they're also, neither of these organizations are partisan, so they don't belong to any political party, and they don't work with any political party. That means they're, again, in that inverted triangle, they're starting with what we know, they're asking why we should care as Christians, and then trying to think about how we can actualize change on all levels, including in a policy sphere. We also have organizations like Arasha. I sit on the board for Arasha USA, and they're really a great example of a Christian conservation organization. And I mentioned about restoration, a hope for restoration. So they're really kind of coming alongside local communities who want to think about how to better restore people with the places where they live, or maybe learning from what's working well. What do you know about the places that you live, about the land that you care for and you work? What does restoration look like for you, and how can we support that? And then I also work with some global organizations. So Tear Fund USA is like a relief and development organization, and they really center the impact of climate change on all of their relief and development work. So maybe if global development is something that maybe seems interesting to you, I just want to emphasize that there's a lot of work being done to think about how, if you're going to care about maybe reducing poverty in the farming communities in Malawi where some of our projects occur, that you have to take into account the fact that they're dealing with extreme and increasingly extreme variability in terms of weather conditions and climate, and that's impacting their ability to farm. So if you care about investing in their livelihoods and thinking about how you encourage and equip them as an agricultural community in that context, it means taking climate change seriously. And I think that goes for any community, but just an example of how we think about it externally. And then one of the other ones I want to plug is Asabel. So Asabel Institute actually works with Christian colleges and universities across the country. And I know you don't have any environmental science classes here, but maybe if that's something that's of interest to you and you don't have opportunity to take a class here, what they do is they explicitly provide field-based courses in a range of environmental topics where you can go take a class there and get credit and transfer it back to your host college or university, and it's explicitly designed for smaller colleges to just give you more experience that you might just not have opportunity to take that kind of field-based course. And I teach their land resources course and their environmental policy course, and I love seeing the diverse range of students that we get in those courses. So just plugging them as an institution that's trying to do that integration as well. So I'm going to pause there because I gave you a lot, hopefully, to think about, and I would just invite some questions and response from you. Maybe, what are things that you heard that resonate with you, that make sense? Maybe you hadn't thought about it that way, but it makes sense to you. Or what are some things where you're still having questions, or where you might still see some conflict, or just some places where you might see some uncertainty or confusion? But I'd welcome any questions or any points of discussion. Yes.
Let me grab it.
Great.
My background is in economics, and so I'm always talking about trade-offs. And one of the key, if I can transition to another concept as well, one of the key value propositions out of my Christian faith is the attitude of humility. I don't know it all. How do you deal with a situation in which the major contending voices often don't exhibit very much humility and rarely talk about trade-offs? They always talk about, this is my preferred solution to the problem, as if there were no downside to the...
Well, I think those are really important points. So first of all, on the concept of economics and trade-offs, I think economics is a
Rachel, you may have turned. Can you? They're saying in the back that the mic is off. Okay. Any other questions for Rachel? Let me. Could you be more conveniently placed, Trinity? Let me get the mic to you. So.
So this might be a bit more of a personal question, but what have you learned about God through your research and through your experience with studying climate change? Maybe what do you know about him now that you didn't before?
I love that question.
Thank you.
So, I am just being reminded how loving and merciful the Lord is. So sometimes I get really overwhelmed with feeling the responsibility that I have that I've contributed to all sorts of challenges that we're facing. Sometimes I feel like I'm just one individual, and I feel like that I've contributed to some of these problems, and I'm trying to figure out what can I do and all the things. And I remember that the Lord is merciful. He loves the world more than I could possibly love it. He's already at work loving and restoring his world, and I just am invited to join him in it. That all the problems of the world don't rest on me. And speaking about humility, I shouldn't think that somehow I or this group of people are going to be the savior of the world. No, we have a savior. He loves it. He's merciful to us even when we mess up and we don't always get it right. And so we can be humble in that, while also being so hopeful because of who he is and the fact that he already told us that he loves and cares for it. So the work that we do in response to that is so meaningful every day, and I think it helps me avoid discouragement or despair sometimes when it feels like it just seems overwhelming. It seems like we're not getting it or we're not doing it enough. That I'm reminded that no, the Lord is enough, and then he's just asked me to be faithful to him. He's been so merciful and loving, and what a better God to serve than someone who's increasingly every day merciful and loving towards his people. So those are some of the things I've learned. I've also seen evidence of restoration. So sometimes we think about it as an abstract concept, but in the work that I've done on conservation, where I've seen, I spent some time in Peru, and I worked with an organization there, and in an urban context, there was all of these people that were migrating into the city from more rural areas, mostly because of looking for economic opportunity. And then what was happening is they were moving into land that was unoccupied, but it was some of the endemic, meaning locally specific. You could find these ecosystems nowhere else in the world. So it was this beautiful, biodiverse areas, and people were, moving in and basically, constructing and building homes. And it was sort of this really challenging example of human need and human poverty, but also destruction of the local environment. And yet we had opportunities to think about how the local church was actually out in front in thinking about ways to help meet local needs by protecting the environment, because they needed access to fresh water. So actually those communities were on the front lines of restoring some of those ecosystems and protecting them, and they directly benefited from access to fresh water. And it was the church out in front leading the way, because they're this is what it means to point people toward the Lord who loves them and asks us to love our neighbor. So I think that's evidence of God's goodness and the fact that we can see glimpses of that in the here and now. It's not just in the future.
So you mentioned agriculture practices as something we need to address, or applications on how we can restore this earth. What other factors or things we do as people to the environment need to be addressed, and are these more or less critical to climate change compared to agricultural practices?
Well, one of the things... Can you hear me? Oh, you can definitely hear me. No, so I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about drivers of change, right? But clearly some of the largest drivers of change are how we think about energy. So where we get our electricity, how we think about our transportation systems, those things are major contributors to climate change. So in terms of addressing some of those core concerns, those should be front and center and on the table. I love land and thinking about the role of land because it can do both. It can help us think about how to contribute by slowing the pace of change, but it also can serve as a way to help us adapt, right? So our food system, we wouldn't have food if it wasn't for our agricultural system. So thinking about how we continue to meet pressing need for food really relies on an agricultural system that is healthy and resilient. So I think there are certainly ways that we could think about improved agricultural practices that contribute to both of those things, just like we could think about how we improve forest management and how we think about wetland management as tools. But in terms of drivers, I mean, agriculture is a driver, but it's not the only one. And when we think about it on a global scale, actually, there's a lot of changes in terms of where, because of globalization, kind of what's driving land use change and land use trade-offs at a much higher scale. So I think there's a lot of good work that already is done to think about stewardship of our land, including agricultural land, and I think that's just increasingly an opportunity to think about it as a tool for both mitigation to some degree, not replacing or supplanting the focus on other key emitters like transportation or energy production. But it just also has a co-benefit in that our relationship with the land is so critical. And so having healthy soils and healthy lands is good for local communities, good for a sustainable food system supply, but also has benefits for climate. Does that address your question?
I think we have time for one more question. Do you got any more questions? So, Rachel, how do you respond to someone that says the world is going to be destroyed at the end anyway? When Christ returns, everything is going to be destroyed, so why should we care about the environment?
Well, first of all, we should care about the environment because we rely upon it every single day. Our health and well-being is really dependent on the health and well-being of this world that God gave us. So even for understanding our current needs or the needs of the next generation, I think it matters. And we're called to be good stewards, so we have to ask what does that mean and how we work and keep the land. But I would also invite you to understand sort of the narrative. If you're a Christian asking me that, the narrative of Scripture is one of hope and restoration and redemption. So actually it's about restoring relationships and making things whole. And as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't just about people in an individual relationship context, but also in how we think about community and society and how we think about creation. So we have to trust that if the Lord cares enough about his world to restore it and redeem it, and he invites us into that work of restoration here and now he's going to use for his purposes in some way. And so it actually matters. The approach to restoration now matters for eternal things too.